The courier arrived at noon, when Vistara Prime's twin suns turned the dusty main street into a shimmering mirage. Nathan was elbow deep in Mrs. Kellerman's Android farmhand, trying to convince its vocal processor that mooing wasn't an appropriate response to every command. When the shadow fell across his workbench, he looked up. The figure standing in his clinic doorway wore ceremonial armor that seemed to drink in the light, all flowing curves and geometric impossibilities. The helmet alone probably cost more than Nathan's entire building. "Dr. Nathan Cross?" The voice emerged from the helmet with unnecessary reverb, like someone had decided normal speech wasn't dramatic enough. "Just Nathan these days," he said, wiping grease on his already ruined shirt. "Haven't used the doctor title since I left the service. And before you ask, no, I don't do house calls, and I definitely don't service whatever fancy tech is hidden under all that armor." The courier reached into a compartment that definitely hadn't been visible a moment ago and produced a crystal tablet. It pulsed with inner light, displaying a seal Nathan recognized from old news broadcasts, a stylized constellation that marked documents from the Sky Throne itself. "You are summoned by royal decree to appear before Queen Seraphina Vial of Andralis, Defender of the Outer Reach, Keeper of the Seven." "Does she have a lot of titles?" Nathan interrupted. "Because I've got 3 more repairs scheduled today, and Mrs. Kellerman's android thinks it's a cow." The helmet turned toward him with what might have been disapproval. Hard to tell with helmets. "Her Majesty's titles number 47 in the formal recitation. I've been merciful." "Appreciated. So what does a queen want with a washed-up medic on a backwater colony?" Nathan set down his tools and actually looked at the tablet. The text was written in both standard and high Andralis script, the latter flowing across the crystal surface like liquid silver. It was beautiful and utterly unhelpful. The summons gave no reason, no explanation, just coordinates and a deadline 3 days away. "Her Majesty's business is her own," the courier said. "A transport will arrive tomorrow at dawn. Be ready." "And if I don't feel like being ready?" The courier's hand moved to something at their belt. For a moment, Nathan wondered if refusing a royal summons came with immediate consequences of the vaporization variety. Then the courier pulled out a small chip and placed it on the workbench. "Her Majesty anticipated you might require persuasion. This contains 50,000 credits, transferred to your account the moment you board the transport. Consider it compensation for your time." Nathan stared at the chip. 50,000 credits would fix his clinic's failing climate control, replace the diagnostic scanner he'd been nursing along for 2 years, and possibly convince Mrs. Kellerman's android that it wasn't livestock. It would also leave enough for him to finally upgrade the settlement's water purification system, which had been making concerning noises since last winter. "That's either very generous or very desperate," he said. "Her Majesty is rarely desperate." The courier turned to leave, then paused. "I'm told to inform you that refusal would be disappointing." "Disappointing like she'll be sad, or disappointing like orbital bombardment?" "Her Majesty does not bomb people who disappoint her." A pause. "Usually." After the courier left, Nathan stood in his quiet clinic, surrounded by half-repaired equipment and the faint smell of synthetic lubricant. Through the window, he could see Vistara Prime's modest skyline, a handful of buildings barely tall enough to deserve the name, solar collectors glinting in the afternoon light, the dried-up fountain in the town square that nobody had bothered fixing in 5 years. He'd built a life here. Small, simple, uncomplicated. No command chains, no combat zones, no holding frightened soldiers while the world exploded around them. He'd left all that behind when he mustered out 12 years ago, traded his field medic kit for repair tools, and his officer's commission for blessed anonymity. The crystal tablet pulsed gently on his workbench, waiting for acknowledgement. Behind him, Mrs. Kellerman's android chose that moment to moo again, the sound echoing through the empty clinic like some kind of mechanical commentary on his life choices. Nathan picked up the tablet and pressed his thumb to the acceptance seal. The crystal flared bright, confirming his attendance, and somewhere in the distance he imagined he could hear the universe laughing at his attempt to stay retired. Whatever a queen wanted with him, it probably wasn't going to be boring. That thought should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the first rumble before an avalanche. That moment when you realize the ground beneath your feet has already started moving, and all you can do is hold on and hope you survive the ride. He had 3 days to finish his repairs, pack a bag, and figure out what you wore to meet royalty. Knowing his luck, formal occasions probably required more than his 2 clean shirts and the jacket with only minor burn marks. Mrs. Kellerman's android moved again. Nathan sighed and got back to work. The transport that arrived at dawn looked like someone had taken a conventional starship and decided geometry was merely a suggestion. Nathan stood at the landing pad with his single duffel bag, watching the craft settle onto the ground with absolutely no regard for how physics was supposed to work. Parts of it seemed to exist at angles that shouldn't fit together, and the hull shimmered with that peculiar quality he'd only seen in Andralis technology, like it was deciding whether to be solid or not. A ramp extended with a soft hiss. Nathan climbed aboard, and immediately his inner ear informed him that up and down were having a philosophical disagreement. First time on an Andralis vessel? The pilot was human, thankfully, which made Nathan feel slightly less out of his depth. She had the relaxed posture of someone who'd made this trip 1,000 times and found it only mildly interesting. Is it that obvious? You're green and we haven't even left Atmo yet. She gestured to a seat that looked more like a sculpture than furniture. Sit anywhere. The ship will adjust to you. Probably. Probably. Andralis Tech has opinions. Sometimes it decides you'd be more comfortable somewhere else and rearranges itself. Try not to panic if your seat migrates to a different deck. The journey took 6 hours, which Nathan spent alternately fascinated and nauseated. The viewport showed space in ways he'd never seen, colors that shouldn't exist, stars that seemed close enough to touch, and at one point, what he could have sworn was a nebula waving at them. The pilot assured him that was normal. Nathan decided not to ask what normal meant in this context. Andralis appeared like a jewel against the void. The planet itself was green and blue, but floating in high orbit was the Sky Throne, a palace that made absolutely no sense. Towers spiraled upward and downward simultaneously. Gardens bloomed in open courtyards exposed to vacuum, and bridges connected sections that seemed miles apart, yet somehow adjacent. It rotated slowly, catching the light of the system's sun and throwing it back in prismatic patterns. Yeah, everyone stares the first time, the pilot said. Wait until you see the inside. I've been here 50 times and I still get lost. They docked at a platform that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. A steward met Nathan at the airlock. Another human, this one wearing robes that shifted color with each movement. He introduced himself as Garrett and spoke with the weary patience of someone who'd guided many confused visitors through the palace's impossibilities. Stay close, Garrett said. The palace rearranges based on the queen's needs and moods. Yesterday, the throne room was north. Today, it's vertical. Vertical? You'll see. They walked through corridors where gravity was a polite suggestion rather than a law. Nathan watched water flow upward in crystalline streams, suspended in the air like living sculptures. Gardens grew from walls and ceilings, flowers blooming in colors that hurt to look at directly. Other visitors passed them, some human, many not, all moving with the casual confidence of people who'd accepted that reality was flexible here. They turned a corner and suddenly stood in a forest. Not a garden, an actual forest, with trees that stretched impossibly high and roots that disappeared into mist below. The path wound between trunks that hummed with internal light. The queen grew these herself, Garrett said. They sing when she's happy. Right now they're humming, which means she's focused. You'll know if she gets angry. Do I want to know what they do when she's angry? They played discordant jazz. It's unsettling. The forest opened into a vast chamber where the floor was transparent crystal, showing the planet far below. The throne sat at the chamber's center, carved from a single piece of what looked like frozen starlight. And standing before it, speaking with a group of advisors, whose ears marked them as native Andralis, was the queen. Nathan's first thought was that holovids didn't do her justice. Seraphina Vielle wore formal regalia that seemed woven from shadows and silver, her raven hair cascading past her shoulders in an intricate braid threaded with light-catching gems. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her ears rose in those distinctive, elegant points that marked her people. She moved with absolute certainty, gesturing as she spoke, and every person in the room oriented toward her like planets around a sun. His second thought was that he'd never seen her before in his life. The advisors dispersed as Garrett led Nathan forward. The queen turned, and her eyes, deep violet, another Andralis trait, fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to check if he'd forgotten to zip something important. Your Majesty, Garrett bowed. Nathan Cross, as summoned. Nathan managed a bow that probably looked ridiculous compared to Garrett's practice motion. The Queen studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being catalogued, assessed, and possibly found wanting. Then she smiled, and it transformed her entire face from regal to something warmer, almost playful. Nathan Cross, she said, and her voice carried that melodic quality all Andralis voices had, like speaking was halfway to singing. Tell me, do you remember pulling anyone from burning wreckage at Canthros Gate 12 years ago? The question hit him like a physical blow. Canthros Gate, the siege that had turned into a massacre, where he dragged survivors from crashed transports while the sky rained fire. He'd pulled dozens from wreckage that day, held hands and made promises he wasn't sure he could keep. I remember a lot of burning wreckage, Your Majesty, he said carefully. That battle was extensive. She stepped closer, and he noticed a scar along her left temple, barely visible beneath her hair. Do you remember holding someone's hand in the dark, promising they wouldn't die alone? And suddenly, impossibly, he did. A face pale with blood loss, violet eyes struggling to focus, elegant ears half buried in ash and debris. A young lieutenant who'd kept apologizing for bleeding on him while he'd worked to stop the hemorrhaging. He'd stayed with her through the bombardment because moving her would have killed her, and he talked to keep her conscious. Stupid stories about his hometown, terrible jokes about military rations, anything to keep her fighting. You, Nathan said, and his voice came out hoarse. You were the lieutenant, but they told me. The hospital ship was destroyed. I know. I wasn't on it. Seraphina's smile turned sad. I was evacuated on an earlier transport. By the time I recovered enough to ask about the human medic who saved my life, you'd already mustered out. And you'd covered your tracks very well, Nathan Cross. I didn't think anyone would come looking. I looked. She said it simply, as fact. For 12 years I looked. Do you have any idea how many Nathan Crosses exist in human space? I found 47 before I found you. That must have been annoying. The first 3 were particularly disappointing. One was 80 years old, one was currently in prison for smuggling, and one insisted on showing me his collection of vintage Earth music. I heard something called polka. It was traumatic. Her eyes glinted with humor. But I found you eventually, and now you're here. Nathan looked around at the impossible palace, at the Queen who'd apparently spent 12 years tracking down one unremarkable medic, at the crystalline trees beginning to hum a more complex melody. So, he said, what happens now? Seraphina's smile widened. Now, Nathan Cross, you help me repay a debt. And perhaps, if you survive my court's attempts to have you poisoned or thrown off the palace, we finally finish the conversation we started in the fire. The memory came back in fragments, triggered by Seraphina's words like someone had opened a door Nathan had sealed shut years ago. Canthros Gate had been a disaster from the start. The garrison was supposed to hold for 3 days while civilian transports evacuated. They'd held for 6 hours before the orbital bombardment started. Nathan had been working triage in what used to be a supply depot when the call came through. Multiple transports down in the eastern sector, heavy casualties, all other medics engaged or dead. He'd grabbed his kit and run. The transport was barely recognizable as a vehicle anymore. It had carved a trench through the street when it crashed, shedding armor plating and structural components before slamming into the remains of what might have once been a memorial plaza. Fires burned in 3 different sections. The cockpit was gone entirely, along with anyone who'd been sitting there. Nathan had found her in the troop compartment, half buried under debris and 2 dead soldiers. At first, he thought she was dead too. Too pale, too still, too much blood. Then her eyes had opened, violet and unfocused, and she'd tried to speak. Don't, he'd told her, already working to clear the debris. Save your strength. I'm getting you out. Her hand had caught his wrist with surprising strength. Others, she'd managed. Check, others. He checked. There were no others. Just her, somehow still alive despite the metal spar that had punctured her abdomen and the compound fracture in her left leg. He'd started stabilizing her when the artillery barrage began, and suddenly leaving wasn't an option. The world turned into fire and thunder, and all he could do was cover her body with his own and hope they both survived the next few minutes. Hey, he'd said, because silence was worse than talking, you're going to be fine. I've seen way worse. One time I had a guy come in with a plasma rifle stuck through his torso. Still wouldn't shut up about his card game. You're not nearly that bad. She'd laughed, which turned into a cough that produced blood. Not good. Liar, she'd whispered. Absolutely lying. That guy died, but you're not going to. What's your name? Sarah. She'd squeezed his hand as another explosion rocked the ground. Lieutenant Sarah Vial. Well, Lieutenant, I'm Nathan, and I promise you're not dying alone in this wreckage. That's not how this story ends. He'd talked through the entire bombardment. Stupid stories, terrible jokes, anything to keep her conscious and fighting. Her hand had never let go of his, gripping tighter when the pain got bad, relaxing slightly when he managed to get more painkillers into her system. By the time the shelling stopped, he'd told her about his hometown on Earth, his decision to become a medic, and his theory that military coffee was actually a classified weapon designed to build character through suffering. When the evacuation shuttles finally arrived, he'd handed her off to the flight medics with strict instructions on her injuries. She'd still been conscious, barely, and she'd caught his hand one last time. Thank you, she'd said, for the promise. Don't mention it, just stay alive to make me look good. He'd watched her shuttle lift off, then turn back to find more survivors. 3 days later, someone told him the hospital ship carrying the wounded had been destroyed in transit. He'd added Lieutenant Sarah Vial to the long list of people he couldn't save, buried the memory deep, and tried to move on. Except she hadn't died. She'd survived, become a queen, and apparently spent 12 years looking for him. You're staring, Serafina said, pulling him back to the present. They were walking through another impossible section of the palace, a gallery where paintings floated in midair, and the walls occasionally remembered they were supposed to be solid. Is it the ears? Humans always stare at the ears. I'm processing the fact that I made terrible jokes to royalty while covered in blood and debris. You didn't know I was royalty. Neither did I, really. I was just a lieutenant who thought she was going to die in a crashed transport. She paused at a viewport that showed the planet below, green continents swirling with white clouds. I was 47th in line for the throne, distant enough that I joined the military thinking I'd never have to worry about politics or court intrigue. Then the plague came. Nathan had heard about it. Everyone had. The Andralis plague had swept through the royal family like wildfire, killing 46 people before a cure was found. It had been one of those historical footnotes in the war, tragic, but ultimately irrelevant to the larger conflict. You were at war, he said. Canthros Gate happened 3 weeks before the plague hit. I was recovering in a military hospital when I got the news. Everyone ahead of me in succession was dead or dying. My mother, my 3 older sisters, cousins I'd barely met. Her voice stayed level, but Nathan heard the weight beneath it. I went from a lieutenant who'd nearly died in a transport crash to the crown princess in the span of 48 hours. And the only thing I could think was that at least I'd survived Canthros because a human medic had kept his promise. They reached a set of doors that spiraled open in a way that made Nathan's eyes hurt. Inside was a council chamber where a dozen Andralis waited, all wearing expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. A few humans were scattered among them, looking only slightly more welcoming. Your Majesty, one of the Andralis said, his voice making it clear he thought this entire situation was beneath her dignity. This is the human? This is Nathan Cross, Serafina said, and something in her tone made everyone in the room straighten. He will be joining my personal advisory staff, effective immediately. The silence that followed could have been weaponized. With respect, another counselor said carefully, perhaps your Majesty should explain why she's appointing an unvetted human to such a sensitive position? Serafina smiled, and Nathan recognized the expression from when she'd been bleeding out in the wreckage. Stubborn, determined, and absolutely unwilling to back down. Because he saved my life at Canthros Gate, she said simply. And unlike everyone in this room, when he made me a promise, he kept it. The counselors looked at each other. Nathan looked at Serafina, and somewhere in the palace, the crystalline trees started playing something that sounded suspiciously like jazz. The council meeting lasted 3 hours and felt like 6. Nathan sat in a chair that kept adjusting itself to positions it thought were comfortable, but absolutely weren't, while various advisors took turns explaining why appointing him was either brilliant or catastrophic. The arguments blurred together after the first hour. Concerns about security clearances, questions about his qualifications, pointed remarks about how humans couldn't be trusted with sensitive information about Andralis' defensive capabilities. Through it all, Serafina listened with the patience of someone who'd already made her decision and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She sat on her throne, which Nathan was fairly sure had migrated 3 feet to the left since the meeting started, and occasionally interjected with observations that made counselors stumble over their carefully prepared speeches. Lord Cavris, she said during one particularly long-winded presentation about proper vetting procedures, didn't you appoint your nephew to the Defense Council last year after he'd only been in the military for 6 months? Cavris, an older Andralis with silver threading through his dark hair, had the grace to look embarrassed. That was different, Your Majesty. He was family. And Nathan kept me alive when I was bleeding out in a war zone. I'd argue that creates a certain bond. She glanced at Nathan, and he could have sworn she was trying not to smile. Wouldn't you? I'm not sure being covered in someone's blood counts as a formal relationship, Nathan said, then immediately regretted opening his mouth when every eye in the room fixed on him. Oh, good, another counselor said, her tone dry enough to desiccate a planet. He has opinions. I have several, Nathan said, figuring he'd already stepped in it, so might as well commit. Most of them involve wondering why everyone's acting like Her Majesty needs permission to hire her own staff. The silence was immediate and profound. Even the crystalline trees outside seemed to stop humming. Then Serafina laughed, a genuine sound of delight that broke the tension like a hammer through glass. I like him. We're keeping him. The meeting concluded shortly after, with most of the council looking vaguely disturbed and several shooting Nathan looks that suggested he shouldn't accept any food or drink from strangers. Serafina dismissed them all with a wave of her hand, and suddenly Nathan was alone with her in the vast chamber. You're going to make enemies, she said, standing and stretching in a way that suggested throne sitting wasn't nearly as comfortable as it looked. I got that impression when Counselor Theros spent 10 minutes discussing unfortunate accidents that happen to people who don't understand palace protocols. Theros is mostly bluster. It's Cavris you need to watch. He smiled at you. That sounds like a good thing? Not when Cavris does it. Serafina started walking, and Nathan followed, quickly learning that keeping up with a queen meant navigating corridors that changed configuration when you weren't looking. He's been trying to marry me off to his son for 3 years. Having you here threatens that plan. I'm just an advisor. You're a human I trust who isn't beholden to any of the court factions. That makes you dangerous. She led him through an archway that definitely hadn't existed a moment ago, into a garden where flowers bloomed in fractal patterns and the air smelled like rain and starlight. But it also makes you useful. My council is full of people who've known me since I took the throne. They remember me as the desperate lieutenant who became queen by accident. Sometimes I need someone who knew me before all this. They walked in silence for a while. The garden was beautiful in that unsettling Andralis way. Too perfect, too precise, like someone had convinced nature to follow mathematical principles. Water flowed upward in spiraling streams before dispersing into mist that tasted faintly of copper. Can I ask you something? Nathan said finally. You're asking permission to ask permission. That's very human. Why did you really spend 12 years looking for me? Not the official reason about repaying debts. The real reason. Serafina stopped walking. She stood beneath one of the crystalline trees, its inner light casting patterns across her face that made her look simultaneously ancient and impossibly young. Do you know what happens when you become a queen? She said quietly. Everyone starts treating you like a symbol instead of a person. Every conversation becomes calculated. Every smile has an agenda. Every kind word comes with expectations attached. She turned to face him. But when I was dying in that transport, you didn't see a lieutenant or royalty or anything except someone who needed help. You made stupid jokes about military coffee and told me about your hometown like we had all the time in the world. You promised I wouldn't die alone, and you meant it. I was just doing my job. Your job was to stabilize me and move on to the next casualty. You stayed through a bombardment. You held my hand. Her voice softened. I've had thousands of people bow to me, Nathan. I've had advisors and generals and diplomats all offering their loyalty. But I've never forgotten the person who saw me as worth saving when I was just a scared soldier covered in blood. Nathan didn't know what to say to that. The garden hummed around them, the crystalline trees picking up some melody he couldn't quite identify. Also, Serafina added, her tone shifting back to something lighter. You're the only person in 12 years who's told me I was being ridiculous. Do you know how refreshing that is? I never said you were ridiculous. You implied it heavily when I insisted on searching for you. That's different than saying it. Not according to Cavris's 40-minute lecture on human communication styles. She started walking again, leading him deeper into the garden. You're having dinner with me tonight. Fair warning, it'll be formal. There will be at least 6 courses, and someone will probably try to poison you. Which course? Usually the third. The soup is traditional. She glanced back at him, and her smile was pure mischief. Don't worry, I've built up an immunity to most toxins. You'll only be moderately sick. That's comforting. I thought so. Welcome to the Sky Throne, Nathan Cross. Try not to die before we've properly caught up. The formal dinner turned out to be less about eating and more about surviving a carefully choreographed diplomatic battlefield. Nathan sat at Seraphina's right hand in a dining hall where the ceiling displayed a real-time view of the galaxy above them, stars wheeling slowly overhead as courses appeared and disappeared with theatrical precision. The third course was indeed soup. Nathan eyed it suspiciously while an Andralis dignitary across the table discussed trade agreements in excruciating detail. It's safe, Seraphina murmured, not looking at him. This time, Lord Cavris's son is seated too close. Poisoning you while his family might accidentally ingest the toxin would be poor form. She took a delicate sip of her own soup. Next course, however, is fair game. Nathan was contemplating the wisdom of eating anything at all when the room's ambient lighting flickered. Once, twice, then steady again. Several guards stationed along the wall straightened, hands moving to weapons that looked like they'd been grown rather than forged. Seraphina set down her spoon with careful precision. That's not supposed to happen. Should we be concerned? Nathan kept his voice low. The palace's systems are tied to my biorhythms. Lighting flickers mean something's disrupting the connection. She stood smoothly, and every conversation in the hall died instantly. My apologies, everyone. Please continue your meal. I need to check something. Nathan stood with her, which earned him several sharp looks from the other diners. Seraphina didn't comment, just started walking toward the nearest exit with Nathan, and 4 guards falling in behind her. They'd barely reached the corridor when the explosion hit. It wasn't close, somewhere deep in the palace's lower levels, but the entire structure shuddered like a living thing in pain. The crystalline trees they passed shrieked in discord, and the gravity stabilizers hiccuped, sending Nathan stumbling sideways into a wall that felt more like gel than stone. Throne room, Seraphina snapped, already running. That came from the throne room. They moved through corridors that were actively reconfiguring, the palace's defenses waking up in response to the attack. Walls slid into new positions, doorways sealed themselves, and security drones materialized from alcoves Nathan was certain had been empty moments before. His combat medic instincts kicked in, old training resurfacing as he cataloged exits, assessed threats, and stayed close to Seraphina's left side. Her weak side, he remembered from the battlefield, where that old injury sometimes made her movements slightly slower. The throne room was chaos. Smoke billowed from a breached wall panel, and 3 figures in armor that bent light around itself were engaged with palace guards. 2 guards were down, one moving weakly, the other ominously still. More guards poured in from multiple entrances, weapons firing in coordinated patterns that suggested extensive training. Stay back, one of Seraphina's guards commanded, trying to position himself between the queen and the fighting. Seraphina ignored him completely, her hand moving to a bracelet Nathan hadn't noticed before. It unfolded into something that looked like a blade made of solid light, humming with barely contained energy. Nathan, the wounded guard, he was already moving. The old training kicked in like he'd never left the service, his feet carrying him in a combat crouch toward the fallen guard, while his mind assessed injuries from 20 feet away. Plasma burns, severe but treatable. The other guard wasn't breathing. Nathan reached the wounded one as an attacker broke through the defensive line, heading straight for Seraphina. She met the attack with fluid precision, her light blade deflecting a strike that would have taken her head off. The attacker pressed the assault, forcing her back toward the damaged wall. Nathan grabbed the wounded guard and started dragging him toward cover, his medic instincts warring with the urge to help Seraphina. Then a second attacker appeared behind her, rising from what Nathan could have sworn was solid floor. Sarah! The old nickname came out without thinking, the warning sharp and urgent. She spun, blade coming up, but she was off balance and the attacker was too close. Nathan did the only thing he could think of. He threw his med kit. It hit the attacker's helmet with a satisfying crack, disrupting their strike just enough for Serafina to recover and drive her blade through their midsection. The attacker collapsed, their light-bending armor failing to reveal standard military gear underneath. The third attacker saw their companions fall and made the intelligent choice to run. They didn't get far. Palace security had sealed every exit, and the guards took them down with efficient brutality. Serafina stood in the center of her throne room, breathing hard, her blade still active and humming. Then she looked at Nathan, looked at the med kit lying on the floor, and started laughing. Not the polite, controlled sound from earlier, but genuine, slightly hysterical laughter. You threw your med kit at an assassin. It was within reach, Nathan said, already checking the wounded guard's vitals. And it worked. It worked, she agreed, deactivating her blade. The bracelet reformed, looking innocent again. Lord Cavris is going to have an aneurysm when he hears about this. Should I be offended that you find assassination attempts funny? Third one this year. You get used to it. She knelt beside him, examining the wounded guard with a practiced eye that reminded Nathan she'd been a lieutenant before she was a queen. How bad? Bad enough. He needs a medical bay, not a field patch. Nathan worked quickly, stabilizing the worst of the damage. Your palace has a medical facility, right? Please tell me it's not in another dimension or orbiting a separate moon. Same palace, different deck. Guards, get a medical team here now. She helped Nathan lift the wounded guard, her strength surprising. They carried him together toward the nearest medical transport that had materialized from somewhere, guards forming a protective circle around them. In the transport, racing through corridors toward the medical bay, Serafina caught Nathan's eye. Her formal regalia was singed. Her hair had come loose from its elaborate style, and there was a smear of something unidentifiable across her cheek. She looked nothing like a queen, and everything like the lieutenant he'd pulled from burning wreckage. Still think you made the right choice coming here? She asked. Nathan thought about his quiet clinic on Vistara Prime, his simple repairs and peaceful days. Then he looked at the woman beside him, her violet eyes bright with adrenaline and something else. Relief, maybe, or recognition. Like she'd been waiting 12 years to see if he'd stay when things got dangerous. Ask me again after the fourth course, he said. I'm still curious about the dessert. Her laughter followed them all the way to the medical bay. The medical bay was quieter than Nathan expected, all soft lighting and technology that whispered instead of beeped. He'd spent 2 hours ensuring the wounded guard would survive, then another hour deflecting questions from security about the attack. By the time he finished, the twin suns visible through the viewport had shifted position, painting the planet below in shades of amber and rose. He found Serafina in the Royal Observatory, a dome at the palace's highest point where the stars felt close enough to gather in your hands. She'd changed from her formal regalia into something simpler, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she stood at the central platform staring out at the galaxy with an expression Nathan recognized. The look of someone carrying weight they couldn't put down. The guard will make it, he said, announcing his presence, though he's going to have impressive scars. Good. I've already sent word to his family. She didn't turn around. Security identified the attackers. Separatist faction, hired by someone in the outer colonies who thinks I've been too soft on human integration into Andralis space. Ironic, given you just appointed a human to your advisory staff. I suspect that's what triggered it. Cavris has been suspiciously quiet since the attack. She finally looked at him, and her smile was tired. He's either impressed you survived or recalculating how to get rid of you. Nathan walked to the edge of the platform, looking down through the transparent floor at the palace spreading below them. From this height, he could see the crystalline trees in their gardens, now humming a gentle melody that vibrated through the structure. You know, when I got that summons, I thought maybe you needed a medic. Check some lingering injuries from Canthros, make sure everything healed properly, collect my payment, and go home. Would you have come for that? 50,000 credits is 50,000 credits. He glanced at her. But that's not why you looked for me. No. Serafina moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could see the faint scar at her temple, the one he'd closed 12 years ago, with shaking hands and desperate hope. I told myself it was about repaying a debt, that finding you and thanking you properly would let me finally close that chapter. Move on from the frightened lieutenant who nearly died in the wreckage. But, but then I found you, and you walked into my throne room looking completely out of place and slightly annoyed. And all I could think was that you still saw me the same way you did in that transport. Not as a queen, not as a symbol, just as Sarah who needed someone to keep their promise. Her voice softened. Do you know how rare that is? Nathan thought about the court, the careful political maneuvering, the way everyone treated her like a chess piece instead of a person. I'm starting to get the picture. I've built an empire, she said quietly, united three-star systems, negotiated treaties, survived assassination attempts and political coups. I have everything a queen should want, but I spent 12 years remembering a human medic who made terrible jokes about coffee and held my hand in the dark. I told myself I just needed to find you, to thank you, to close that loop. I didn't expect. She stopped, seeming to search for words. Didn't expect me to throw a med kit at an assassin? She laughed, the sound breaking the tension. Didn't expect to still feel like that lieutenant when you're around. Like I don't have to perform or calculate or be anything except the person who survived because someone cared enough to stay. The observatory hummed around them, stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. Nathan had spent 12 years trying to forget the war, building a quiet life where the biggest crisis was a malfunctioning android. He'd convinced himself he was content with small repairs and simple problems. But standing here with Serafina, seeing the woman who'd fought her way from a crashed transport to a throne, he realized he'd been lying to himself. I stayed because you were worth saving, he said finally. That part hasn't changed, though I'll admit the palace is slightly more complicated than a burning transport. Only slightly? The transport didn't try to poison me during dinner. Fair point. She turned to face him fully, and in the starlight, her eyes were the same shade they'd been when she gripped his hand and refused to die. I'm not asking you to stay out of debt or obligation, Nathan. I'm asking because I need someone who remembers that Sarah Vale existed before the crown. Someone who'll tell me when I'm being ridiculous and throw medical equipment at assassins when required. That's a very specific job description. I'm a very specific queen. Her smile turned wry. Though I should warn you, Cavarice is definitely going to try to have you killed, and the council will make your life difficult, and there will be more attacks, more political maneuvering, more dinners where the soup might be lethal. Sounds terrible. It is, frequently. Nathan looked out at the stars, at the impossible palace floating in the void, at the woman who'd spent 12 years searching for a medic who'd kept a promise. He thought about his clinic on Vistara Prime, the quiet life he'd built, the safety he'd chosen. Then he thought about the lieutenant who'd refused to die, who'd become a queen but never forgot the person who'd seen her as worth saving. I'm going to need better equipment, he said. My current med kit is dented and possibly cursed after hitting that assassin. Serafina's face lit up with something that looked like hope and relief tangled together. Done. What else? A map. Your palace makes no sense and I'm tired of getting lost. The palace reconfigures. A map would be obsolete in hours. Then I'm blaming you every time I end up in the wrong section. Acceptable. She held out her hand, palm up, an echo of that moment in the burning transport when she grabbed his wrist and refused to let go. So you'll stay? Nathan took her hand, feeling the same strength that had kept her alive through artillery fire and assassination attempts in 12 years of searching. Someone has to make sure you don't get killed at your own dinner parties. Apparently that's me now. Apparently, she squeezed his hand, and for a moment she wasn't a queen, and he wasn't an advisor. They were just two people who'd survived fire together and found their way back across 12 years and countless stars. The crystalline trees below began playing something new, a melody that wasn't quite jazz but wasn't quite harmony either. Something in between, searching for its resolution. They're confused, Serafina said, listening. They don't know what song to play. Give them time, Nathan said, watching the stars wheel overhead. Sometimes the best songs are the ones nobody's written yet. She smiled, and in that moment, Nathan knew he'd made the right choice. Not the safe one, not the simple one, but the one that mattered. After all, he'd promised once that she wouldn't face the darkness alone. Some promises, it turned out, didn't have expiration dates.